Just as a background, so I used to come to the US as a med student um, when I was still in Rome. And in fact, I tried to put myself in any foreign rotation I could find. So I spent a month in Jerusalem, I spent a month in Denmark, and then I came to the US 4 times. And then I fell in love, of course, with the American medicine of the 1970s. So exactly 40 years ago, this July, I came over for training. My background is a clinician teacher, a pulmonologist with a strong interest in bedside diagnosis. I wrote a book that just came to the third edition. I authored an audio CD on auscultation of the lungs and the chest. But the only reason why I'm bringing that up is because in the 90s, I did a lot of research in how bedside skills were basically disappearing in our high-tech medicine. And that got me to meet a lot of people who still do it. And that's when I realized that they were all humanists. So I came to conclude that what really was missing in medicine was the humanistic side. And I became more and more convinced that humanities change the way you see, you think, you feel, and you interact with the patient. So it's really a different brain. So what I'm currently doing at Jefferson is mostly running the humanities program, the history of medicine program. And since I got married 2 years ago, I gave up patient care. So I'm not seeing patients anymore for 2 years. And I've become more and more interested in topics like the one I'm going to be discussing today. So this was supposed to be a talk that I was asked to give at the national meeting of the American College of Physicians until COVID appended the schedule. And I had proposed it because this year will be the 200th anniversary of Rudolf Virchow's birth and the 100th anniversary of Bernie Lowndes' birth. In fact, if you read the news, Lown, who invented the defibrillator and won a Nobel Peace Prize for co-founding Physicians Against Nuclear War, just passed away a month ago at the age of 99. So I wanted to talk about these two people because I admire them profoundly. And then, of course, COVID came. And COVID gave us a very good sense of why we need to get involved. All right, so let me tell you the third reason why I decided to write this paper and prepare the talk. There is a paper I wrote with my dean on this, which is currently being reviewed, was this reflection I got from one of our third-year students. So he wrote, I'm currently on a pediatric rotation at a clinic in Wilmington, Delaware. There is a wall where families can pin photos of their young children lost to gun violence. We speak at length on a day-to-day basis on the circumstances that these patients were born into. We often ask ourselves if what we do makes much of an impact. For teenagers, we'll check A1C, run routine urine screenings for gonorrhea and chlamydia. But we do wonder if that really matters when the 15-year-old tells us that he drinks a pint of vodka every Friday because he doesn't know how much longer he'll live and he wants to enjoy his time while he's still here. There is no medical fix for that, no treatment we can look for on UpToDate or in a pediatric textbook. Oftentimes, we accept the patient's decision and we make them aware that they can make those choices while doing the most to keep themselves and those around them safe. I hope to continue amplifying the voices of those who often feel drowned out while holding elected officials accountable for the change they claim to agree with. So I read this thing, I made myself a cup of coffee, I reread it, and then I wrote to the kid because he had figured out in 1 year what took me 40 years to figure out, which basically is that you can change much more the health of a population through the stroke of a legislative pen than through all the scalpels and stethoscope of this world. Also, these words collided with what a very serious dean of a very serious medical school in Philadelphia, I'm talking about the University of Pennsylvania, had the gumption to put in the Wall Street Journal just before COVID exploded. So this was a former dean for curriculum, Dr. Goldfarb, and he was complaining that the American College of Physicians was overstepping its lane, encouraging gun control, teaching students about global warming, and social justice in general. He said, if we do that, students are not going to get the proper scientific education. Immediately, the American College of Physicians shouted back that these issues are important because they impact on the health of our patients. And all of this because the poor Annals of Internal Medicine had published a position statement on the fact that this country, and I'm talking about the United States of America, has 330 million people and 400 million guns. And every week we have a mass murder. And of course, nothing is being done. So should physician lead the way? Immediately, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, told physicians to stay in their lane. And this elicited a pushback. The ACP said, we have many lanes. These are some of them. And these other physicians got pissed off enough to say, we're not anti-gun. We are anti-bullet holes in our patients. So this made me think, what is a doctor? What is doctoring all about? Then COVID came, and COVID reminded us that good leadership saves lives, efficient public health saves lives, and there are tremendous discrepancies in healthcare based on race and based on economic status. Just to give you an idea, in this country, if you're Black or Hispanic, you're three more times likely to die from COVID than if you're white. So this even prompted recently in the New York Times an editorial by a public health person at Brown that racism is a public health emergency. But again, brings the issue, is this what doctoring should be about? So is doctoring indeed something that understands that a legislative pen is more powerful than a scalpel and a stethoscope? Now, the other reason why this, of course, is timely is that COVID has taught us that the problems we're facing now as a society have become global. COVID knows no borders. And of course, this was an issue. We wrote a paper on this with the director of ethics, Stony Brook, and I have to confess, he had a hard time getting published because that's the other problem of physicians. We are very conservative. We are part of the problem. So yes, we're all in this together, and none of us will be safe until all of us are safe. For example, if Jair Bolsonaro, through his incompetence in running Brazil, keeps producing variants, we might all be vaccinated in US and we're going to catch it again. So is this a reminder that we are all in this together? And what about leaders? In this country, we had other failure of leadership. So this brings the issue, should physicians fill the gap? Should we fill the void? Are we natural born leaders? After all, we are the ultimate citizens of the world. So let's discuss the job description. What is a doctor? I was telling Rolando, here in the US, they call us providers, not anymore physicians, we're providers. What are the ingredients that go into that unique cocktail that doesn't make a provider, makes a healer? So Osler had some ideas and he wrote them up at the turn of the century. First of all, we are separated from religion. We emancipated from the shackles of priestcraft and caste. Secondly, we see medicine as an art based on science. Thirdly, we have high moral ideals expressed in the most memorable of all human documents, the Hippocratic Oath. But then he adds a fourth element. Fourthly, a physician has to be a cultivated person. No other profession can boast of the same unbroken continuity of methods and ideals. So the point that we needed to have critical thinking, wisdom, a cultivated mind was crucial for Osler, and clearly he embodied it. Now, what is curious is that when in 1910 Flexner changed American medicine and introduced the sciences, he did not want the humanities to disappear. In fact, he wrote it. The practitioner deals with facts of two categories. Chemistry, physics, biology enable him to apprehend one set, but he also needs a different approach to deal with other more subtle elements. Specific preparation in this area is much more difficult. And such enlargement is important because scientific progress has greatly modified It's ethical responsibility. Hence, it goes without saying that this type of doctor has to be an educated person. So, what they are talking about, I think, is critical thinking, which I call wisdom. Now, Carl Sagan, just before dying 25 years ago, wrote his very last book. And this book was on how the only flickering light we have in the darkness of our existence is science. And he wrote prescient words. Science is more than a body of knowledge, it's a way of thinking. I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the key manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of very few, when no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in power, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what is true, we slide almost without noticing back into superstition and darkness. And this, of course, came to pass with COVID. Now, Martin Luther King said that the function of education is to teach people to think critically. And that's a problem because nowadays, half of American college kids lack critical thinking skills. But then there is another aspect to developing your brain, and it's the one that I call the right brain. It's the one that is the undercurrent of wisdom, it's humanities. Now, the vice chair of the Library of America's board of directors put it simply. We need doctors, all right, but not all doctors are the same. If I were to choose between two equally knowledgeable doctors, I'll go with the one who has read Chekhov because he's a fuller human being and he's going to treat me like a fuller human being. If a doctor only knows about medicine, that doctor doesn't know anything about medicine. Now, of course, they're talking about doctors, not providers. So what are they talking about? We need empathy in medicine, and empathy correlates with humanistic studies. We actually proved that in a paper we published a couple of years ago. It was a multi-center studies of several medical schools. There was USF in Florida, Tulane in New Orleans, OHSU in Portland, Oregon, Brown University, and in Philadelphia, Rowan across the river, and our own medical school. We surveyed the entire student body, and we got 740 kids to fill a very extensive questionnaire. And we asked them how much they did in the humanities. And we correlated with all those personal traits whose absence we lament in medicine: empathy, tolerance for ambiguity, resilience, wisdom, and they all strongly correlated with humanistic engagement. In fact, wisdom was the highest. Now, not to disprove that, but just to remind you that Anthony Fauci, who's probably now the most respected and trusted American in these times of COVID, majored in the classics. And Bernie Lown, that I'm going to tell you about, also majored in the classics. In fact, he couldn't even get into medical school as a result of that. And Virchow, the other person I'll tell you about, was a polymath who spoke 7 languages, read Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew, published more works in anthropology and archaeology than medicine itself. So what we're talking about is eclecticism. And of course, I'm talking to an audience of eclectic people. Remain like that. It will make you a better doctor. But then there is a third aspect that goes into the unique cocktail, and it's the fact that medicine comes with social responsibilities. This is the Hippocratic Oath, the version mostly used in medical school. And it states, I will remember that I remain a member of society with special obligations to all my fellow human beings. And that basically means medicine comes with social responsibilities. So advocacy, activism, legislation is and ought to be in our DNA. So Dr. Goldfarb was absolutely incorrect. That's what doctors do. So let me get you to this famous painting of Sir Luke Fildes, the doctor. This is the Victorian doctor. And the Victorian doctor was clearly not a provider. So what is that makes a healer like that? Virchow put it simply: only those who regard healing as the ultimate goal of their efforts can be properly called physicians. Everybody else is a provider. Now I'm going to play for you a short audio clip. It was not by Virchow, of course, and not even by Laun, even though they would have been absolutely capable of saying it. So here it is.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the event, and in the total, all of these acts will be written in the history of this generation.
So few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can change a small portion of the events. And then all of those acts in the total will be written in the history of this generation. As I said, this one was neither Virchow nor Laun. This was actually Bobby Kennedy, who on 6666, very interesting number, which by the way, it was exactly 2 years before he got shot, was asked by the students at University of Cape Town to speak against apartheid, and he went, which was very gutsy. And those words are now on his tomb in Arlington. Here's what he said to the young students, and he was appealing to the young, a little bit like I'm appealing to you, because you're the future. There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Yet, this is the measure of the task of your generation, and the road is strewn with many dangers. Our answer is to rely on youth. The cruelties and the obstacles of this swiftly changing planet will not yield to obsolete dogmas, to outworn slogans. They cannot be changed by those who cling to a present that is already dying, who prefer the illusion of security to the excitement and danger that comes with even the most peaceful progress. The sword demands the qualities of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the life of ease. It is a revolutionary world that we live in, and it is the young people that must take the lead. Thus, you and your young compatriots everywhere have had thrust upon you a greater burden of responsibility than any generation that has ever lived. And these words are 50 years old, but God, they apply to you. We're dealing with existential crises of the planet, and you will have to fix them. So we're talking about clearly global warming, which is our major existential crisis, to the point that in September, the UN Secretary General said that COVID is just dress rehearsal for what is coming. So what is the risk? The risk is Goldfarb, who tells you that that's not what doctors do. The risk is indifference. This is in Milan because, of course, Italians also were indifferent to the deportation of Jewish Italians to Auschwitz. And that is the memorial at the train station. Dante, whose anniversary is coming up this year, absolutely despised the bystanders. He put them in the worst part of his hell. He put them in the ante inferno. They are not even allowed in hell. No one wants them. And Dante forces them to run after a banner because, of course, they never committed in life. Indifference in times of challenge and controversy is akin to complicity. Martin Luther King put it simply: the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy, like our times. So should physicians lead the way? I'm going to tell you about two physicians who thought that indeed physicians lead the way. The first one is a German, Rudolf Ludwig Karl Virchow. And by the way, is pronounced Virchow. And Virchow is a genius in medicine because he gives us finally the last nail on the coffin of the humoral theory. His book, Cellular Pathology, completely proves that all cells come from other cells, and there is no such a thing as spontaneous generation. Changes in cells account for diseases in organs. This is one of the 5 great books of Western medicine. Vesalius gave us anatomy. Harvey, also from Padua, gave us physiology, and Morgagni, also from Padua, gave us pathologic anatomy. Laennec gave us auscultation because by then, courtesy of the Catholic Church, who had castrated scientific development in Italy, everything moved to the northern countries. So Laennec gave us auscultation, and Virchow gave us pathology. And that put the last nail on the humoral theory. The humoral theory that goes back to Galen and lasted almost 1600 years. What was that theory? The theory is that it's an imbalance of humors that causes disease. So to reestablish the balance, you have to bleed the patient, you have to puke the patient, you have to make the patient detonate on the toilet, and eventually you will reestablish eucrasia, which of course was crazy, but that is how they killed George Washington, a vigorous 67-year-old, he was my age, who went horseback riding through the snow for 5 hours, got epiglottitis, and instead of getting a tracheostomy, got blood lead, 2.5 liters of blood, and they killed him. So this all comes to an end with Virchow. So just because of that, we should be extremely thankful to him. He lived a very long life that started with Waterloo and ended with him at the age of 80 being very busy to the point that the trolley he was on that was taking him to a conference was too slow for his taste. So he jumped and he broke a leg. And out of the complications of that fracture, he ultimately died. That gives you an idea of the man. The issue of his times was unification of Germany, that like Italy was still divided. And indeed, the times were very interesting. Let me give you an idea of what happened between Waterloo and the birth of Virchow in 1821. First of all, the Germans are split. In 39 states, Napoleon has abolished the Holy Roman Empire. The British are defeated at New Orleans, and Laennec invents the stethoscope. The British steal from the Dutch South Africa, and the US takes over Florida. The Boer trying to resist against the Brits and gets squashed. Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein. The Germans crack down on those students who wanted a fatherland, and Simon Bolivar liberates Colombia. Parkinson's describes his disease. Schopenhauer publishes The World as Will and Idea. The US and Britain agree that the 49th parallel is the Canadian-American border, and the Zulus under a chief build an empire in Southern Africa that will be squashed by the Brits. George III, the one of no taxation without representation, dies mad, probably of porphyria. John Keats dies in Rome of tuberculosis at the age of 21. A month ago was his 100th anniversary. Faraday builds the first electrical engine, and the US steamship Savannah is able to cross the Atlantic in only 26 days, which is a record. The Italians are trying to unify, and the Kingdom of Naples cracks down on the Carboneria. The Greeks are also trying to unify, and they revolt against the Turks. Britain tightened its grip on West Africa, which means slaves and gold. The US has now 10 million, and first gas well is tapped in Fredonia, New York. This is scary as a number, which means it took us only 200 years from the first gas well tapped till the global warming that is essentially ruining the planet now, just 200 years. Now, the Italians are still in ferment, and Davy Crockett goes to Congress, Napoleon dies, and bingo, Rudolf Virchow is born. Where? He's born in Pomerania, which now is mostly Poland because of the upheaval of the Second World War. Pomerania is mostly famous for funny little dogs, but Virchow is born in a small town that is now Polish. And just to give you an idea of how much it changed, the capital of East Prussia, the Königsberg, where Immanuel Kant lived all his life, is now Russia. And Putin doesn't even let you in unless you give him $500. And I refuse to go there. Plus, the city was totally leveled during World War II. But just to give you an idea of how Virchow's war disappeared, Königsberg is now Kaliningrad. All right, so who is he? He's an only child of a middle-class, relatively poor family with some Polish blood. So he's an outsider. Being an outsider is actually good for creativity. Family has troubles financial. The father has to moonlight as a village treasurer. Mother is always worried. Virchow is a bright kid, little dynamo. It's not particularly tall, 5'2", 5'3", goes to the community school, excels at his studies, and then goes to the gymnasium, the high school. And there he also excels. So knows Latin, graduates top of his class, and in his graduation thesis foretells his life motto. A life filled with toil and work is not a burden, it's a blessing. Then he wants to become a physician, but he has no money. So he does what many of my students do here in the US. He joins the army. And this, even though the guy is a patriot, but he's not a warmonger. So he studies in Berlin, and it's a good medical school with good teachers. And it's a haunting curriculum. 60 hours of classes, 48 of lectures, to the point that he writes to his father. So he goes unceasingly every day, from 6 in the morning to 11 in the evening, except Sunday. And how rapidly days and weeks fly, you can see for yourselves. One becomes so tired that in the evening he sets his eyes towards the bed eagerly, from which he rises in the morning as tired as if he had slept enough lethargy. And yet, he finds time to study logic, history, and Arabic poetry. He reads Greek and Hebrew, becomes proficient in French, in Dutch, in Arabic. He teaches himself Italian during the summer before medical school, and he gets interested in politics, and eventually in archaeology and anthropology. Now, the father is getting concerned because this bright kid that he wanted to come back home and become a GP seems to be a bit too idealistic. He writes of acquiring no less than a universal knowledge of nature from the Godhead down to the stone. So the father says, chill, come back here, work in the village, and accuses him to be arrogant. Virchow writes back, you state that I'm a selfish person, that is possible, but also you accuse me of being arrogant, and that is far from being true. Real knowledge is conscious of its ignorance. How painfully do I feel the gaps in my knowledge? It is for this reason that I don't stand still in any branch of science. And then he adds, you wanted to make me into a society man, something for which I don't care. In every school vacation, you told me that all my knowledge was worthless without that. Now my time is filled with hearing, learning, and repeating things that are useless to me, while for the things that really interest me, I can find only time at the expense of my health. And yet I occupy myself zealously with that which I don't desire and which I find unpleasant, because I understand that at some time may very well become the only means of my support. I will reconcile myself to it. I will even be able to renounce my favorite occupations. But I want to say this, that in me there is certainly much pride and egoism, even more than is good. Also a lot that is fantastic, dreaming, is an idealist, together with perhaps a little good. But you misunderstand me if you think that my pride is based on my knowledge, the incompleteness of which I can see best. It is based on the consciousness that I want something better and greater, that I feel a more earnest striving for intellectual development than most other people. So here he is, and notice that, by the way, he already has secured a binaural stethoscope, which in those years was rare. So how does he look? Well, he looks a little bit like Jiminy Cricket, He's 5'6", has a serious-looking face, and by the time he ages and he adds a beard, he looks more like Yoda. But Yoda is brilliant. While he's still in medical school, he makes and names 3 major discoveries. So he discovers leukemia and he names it because, of course, he knows Greek. He discovers embolism and thrombosis, which in those years were totally unknown. Prince Charlotte of England dies of postpartum pulmonary embolism, and they couldn't even figure it out. She's the one who opened the way to Victoria. So Virchow is the one who does it. So they give him a job, and the job is at the Charité. And he writes to his father, there's a lot going on politically. And during all these great happenings, I continue to work. And I'm editing my journal. So Virchow was getting tired of not being accepted in the journals he submitted his papers to. So he founded a journal for himself, and that journal still exists, the Archive. And then he adds, in years of great mental depression and unrest in the inner life of the people, only the very great men or the very little ones can ignore the tremendous social changes and concern themselves with the minute manifestations of nature. What he's talking about is Voltaire. Folks, remember Voltaire in Candide tells us that world is messy. We're not going to fix it. This is not the best of all possible worlds, and probably will never be. So, but when Voltaire wrote that, he was an old man. The best thing we can do is, as he put it, to cultivate our garden and send everybody to hell. So basically to retire to Venice, where I have a house, drink a lot of Prosecco, eat a lot of mantecato di bacala, and forget about the world. That's what the Romans did when the barbarians were roaming the countryside. But Virchow is telling us that no, we should get involved. So he gets involved. How come? Well, what was going on in those years is that Europe was in turmoil because despite Napoleon and the 20 years of Napoleonic War, they had put back the kings in power, and everybody didn't like it, particularly the Germans. The Germans wanted unification. And so everything eventually blew up when in 1848, to this day in Europe, when you have to say it's a big mess, you say it's a 48. And the funny thing is that this enormous blow up started in France when the French were forbidden by the king to celebrate George Washington's birthday. And they went to the barricades. They kicked out the king. They created a second republic. And from there, the revolution spread to Italy, first to Milan, and then Venice, and then Vienna, and then Budapest, and then Rome, and ultimately the Berlin of Virchow. So Virchow in those years at that time was also busy because Prussia had an epidemic in Silesia. Silesia is the southern region of Prussia that was mostly populated by Slavs, by Poles, under the control of the Germans. And it's an interesting area because it's also at the border with Bohemia. So you got Germans, Bohemians, Slavs. Incidentally, I was told when I visited there that the Silesian women are the most beautiful on the planet, maybe all that crossbreeding. Silesia is where John Paul II was from, and something not to brag about, Silesia is also where Auschwitz is located. In those years, Silesia had a typhus epidemic, and Virchow wants to study it. So he writes to his father, what must the Austrians be thinking as they see their artificial system crash and burn? Switzerland, Italy, Denmark, all on the road to freedom. France in agitation, restless in Hungary. In fact, the more unhappy are the social conditions, the worse it will be. This distress in Silesia, for example, is so shameful that all government excuses can't change it a whit. No matter what they say, the scandal brought about by the death of thousands can't be whitewashed. Moreover, from a medical standpoint, it's interesting. So he wants to study it, and he gets it because the Prussian government, bad mistake, decides to send him there to report. He's 27-year-old, And he understands very quickly that the reason why these poor local weavers of Polish descent are getting sick with typhus is because society has failed them. The hygienic conditions are miserable. It's the environment that did it. So he writes a scathing report. And in the report, he reviews the history of Silesia. And he writes, most of the land was eventually colonized by the Germans and became entirely Germanized. But in Upper Silesia, 700 years were not enough to remove the Polish stem from its inhabitants. But it did disrupt their sense of national unity. It corrupted their language. It broke their spirit. So the neighboring peoples speak of them contemptuously as the diluted Polacks. And to blame this epidemic on the poor Poles, that high-spirited people capable of the greatest sacrifices, is slanderous. One should not forget the conditions that make them groan. People here meet death with a degree of pleasure, since he releases them from such a miserable existence. And when help finally came to these poor people, there were some Germans who complained that they were being pampered. When those who had nothing to eat, absolutely nothing, were given a daily pound of flour, there was talk of pampering. So he goes back to Berlin all charged up after having written a scathing report. And then, of course, immediately after, it's the revolution. So what is the solution that Virchow suggests? The solution is democracy, education, freedom, and prosperity. He writes, tax the rich rather than the poor, separate church and state, build roads, encourage cooperatives, educate the people, and let the Silesian speak Polish. In fact, he even concludes by saying, medicine is a social science, hence has the obligation to offer social solutions. And the answer is culture, with freedom and prosperity. Without our notice, medicine has carried us into the social sphere, there to meet up with the great problems of our time. Let us all be aware that we're not talking here of treating patients with medicines or adjusting their home environment. No, we're dealing with an entire culture of 1.5 million of our fellow citizens that have been physically and morally abused. Palliative measures will fail. Only radical action gives hope. In fact, the term radical with a K is very frequently used by Virchow in his report. He even argues that they should go to the barricades, they should rebel. If their lethargy can be dispelled by anything by war, let them fight. I deeply regret that fire and sword must rage throughout a nation to bring about the necessary social changes. But mankind hasn't yet reached that stage in its cultural evolution wherein all its dealings are ruled by reason. Now, this is nothing new. There was a French intellectual at the time of Benjamin Franklin named Pierre Carbonnier, who was the first to say sickness is the result of the blunders of society. So Virchow adopts that idea. To him, anything is the result of social injustice. Typhus, but cholera, TB, scurvy, even cretinism. And again, he's convinced that the distribution of wealth unequal is the reason for this, and physicians have to fix it. Disease is a reflection of societal failures. Physicians are the natural attorneys of the poor. Social problems should be their responsibility. Medicine is a social science. So this, of course, is something that finally we're getting to understand too. Here in the US, the American College of Physicians published a position paper on this. And this is really a nice epiphany when you realize that 80% of health outcomes depend on social determinants of disease. So disease is a reflection of societal failure. Now, Virchow also has this idea, there was the idea of Giuseppe Mazzini in London, that we are here on earth to improve ourselves. And the only function of government is to give us the tools for that. And the main two tools are education and healthcare, which are not a business, they are a right, they are a human right. So Virchow realizes that the best way to achieve that is the stroke of a legislative pen. And he goes into politics. Improvement in medicine will eventually prolong human life, but improvements of social conditions will do it faster and better. And as soon as he gets back, there is a revolution. And Virchow builds barricades. He takes his medical students to the barricades, and he realizes that he's a leader. He writes to his father to calm his mother down, that there is no need to worry, by saying, yes, I've known for a long time that I understand the trends pretty quickly. I misjudge people, but never the times. So I realized that as a scientist, I have to be a Republican, because a republic is the only form of government where the laws of nature and the nature of man can be realized. But don't worry, my share in the uprising was minimal. I helped build a few barricades, but then I could only get hold of an old pistol, so I was of little service. That is not true, because a friend writes the following. The revolution had just broken out when Virchow, in frantic haste, rushed into my father's study. Schleich, have you got any weapons? I only have this old gun and a rusty saber. Fine, out with them, off to the barricades. And he was gone. So he plays a role and gets even elected to parliament, but he's too young. So instead of serving, he creates a paper that allows him to have a bully pulpit. And he starts making fun of the authorities, particularly of the government that is paying his salary. He also proclaims his agnosticism, which is not a good idea in a society that is deeply religious and orthodox. So clearly, he's going to pay a price. The first price is that he gets fired. The Charité fires him. And then they close his paper. The students manage to get him reappointed, but he has to sign a humiliating statement that says the following. I freely pledge that I will not give my political convictions, of whatever nature they may be, the remotest form of outward expression. This is particularly true of my relation with the Charité, its employees and physicians, and of the lectures I give in the morgue. Eventually, he realizes that it's time to get out of town, and he goes to Bavaria. But he tells his mom, in times like ours, when it seems that all initiative had been lost, I regarded it my civic duty to place myself at the forefront of the agitation. The improvement of the working classes was impossible under the old constitution. The will of the king alone was law. Hence, we had to overthrow the old regime. The king shall have no will other than the will of the people. Special privilege and class distinction must disappear. But to achieve that, the cultural level of the people must be raised. So the goal, of course, of liberty and justice was put on the back burner. Virchow does two interesting things. First, he gets married, and he marries a very good woman. Behind every great man, there is always a great woman, and behind every great woman, there is always a great man. They will stay together until the end, and theirs will be a loving relationship. Then, of course, he goes to Bavaria, rebuilds himself his reputation as the leader of European pathology. He publishes his book and is now called the Pope of Medicine. That allows him to go back to Berlin with a vengeance, gets himself appointed to city council, then to the regional parliament, the Prussian parliament, and ultimately to the national parliament, the Reichstag. And he will serve there for 13 years, pass laws so liberal to make Berlin a model city for hygiene. He even founds his own party, a party that is in opposition to Bismarck. And that is because Virchow was convinced that pretty much like the cells have to live in a cell state, so human beings have to participate in society. And that doesn't go down too well with Bismarck. Bismarck tells him in parliament, politics is not an exact science. I fully recognize the prominence of the speaker in his field of expertise. He's talking about Virchow. But he has amateurishly stepped out of his field and into mine. So I must say that his politics strikes me as lightweight, which basically means stay in your lane. Virchow, of course, sends him to hell, and Bismarck challenges him to a duel. Now, Bismarck was a 6-footer and Virchow was 5'6". So Virchow said, okay, I'll fight you as long as we do it with scalpels, and the fight never took place. Now, again, for Virchow, healthcare was a human right that has to be pursued politically. That's why 40 years ago, Leon Eisenberg wrote an American Journal of Medicine piece titled, Virchow, where are you now that we need you? This was at the beginning of the Reagan years. Imagine what Eisenberg would write now if he were still alive. Now, Virchow also pisses off the Nazis. Of course, there were no Nazis in those years, but the Germans were already getting a bit cocky about race. And Virchow does a study to prove that in Berlin, there were as many blonde hair and blue-eyed Jewish kids than Aryan kids. He studies 7 million German school children for that. He will become persona non grata for the Nazis. Keeps himself busy with autopsies, with a curiously eclectic mind, to the point that he joined Schliemann at Troy to dig, and even pioneers the idea of X-ray mummies, so you can see what is hidden. He's busy with anthropology, to the point that he collects 4,000 carefully measured skulls, and he used that to prove that there is no correlation between race and cranium capacity. In fact, he will ultimately write more papers in archaeology and anthropology than medicine. His office is a mess, but it's controlled chaos. There is the story of a young doctor who has sent him a paper and never heard from him. So he pays him a visit. Virchow looks at him and says, "Aha, you think I don't know where your paper is? There it is." And he produces it from a pile. It's a good paper, and I'll publish it. I told you I had a wonderful relationship with his wife. This is during their golden anniversary. And then that fatal journey on the trolley that was too slow. When Virchow dies, he leaves behind one wife, 3 sons, 3 daughters, 19 grandchildren. He leaves behind a Germany that with him has lost 4 great men: a pathologist, an anthropologist, a sanitarian, and a liberal politician. In 3 of those fields, Germany will do well. It's only in politics that, unfortunately, after World War I, things will change. But nowadays, finally, after 2 major civil wars called World War I and World War II, Europe is slowly trying to attain the ideals of Virchow of democracy, culture, freedom, and prosperity. And I'm sure he would have been happy. All right, so the point is, are we the natural attorneys of the poor? I don't know about Canada, but I looked it up in the US, and we are not. So first of all, we have a very small representation in Congress. To give you an idea, between 1960 and 2004, that is almost 50 years, only 25 physicians had served. And most of them are conservative Republicans who recently have as their main goal to kill Obamacare. From 2017 to 2019, there were 16 physicians in Congress, all males, and 14 members of the Republican Party, including this guy. And I don't know if the news reached Canada, but Rand Paul, an ophthalmologist from Kentucky, that was even rumored to be a presidential candidate, had the nasty reputation of telling the public the masks don't work. And in fact, he proudly never wore one, and thus was the first member of the US Senate to catch it. And even worse, he kept attending Senate lunches and using the Senate gym while he was being tested, which means he infected willingly and knowingly lots of people. This brings us back to a big issue. Should we push back when people like him spread misinformation? And the answer is absolutely. So this is a cardiologist from Washington who believes the masks don't work and testified to Congress about it. And this is a rheumatologist from Arizona who believed the hydroxychloroquine was helpful and testified to Congress about it. That sends very bad mixed messages to the public. So the New York Times did write about it. When doctors use the language and authority of their profession to promote false medical information, they are not simply expressing their misguided opinions. They have crossed the line into malpractice. But where's the outcry from medical leaders, from various professional organizations? Where was Stanford University when its faculty member Scott Atlas was telling the public not to use face masks? Even JAMA wrote a piece on this. So the minimum you can do is to push back. Now, who's in Congress now? Okay, half of American Congress is business people. That's already a problem. The second third is lawyers, which is interesting because there is a famous saying that politicians are mostly people who had too little morals and ethics to remain lawyers, but that is a tangent, so let's keep on going. What about doctors? In the current Congress, there are 14 physicians, 10 in the House, 4 in the Senate. That's 2.6% of Congress. In the US, there are 1 million practicing physicians and 1.3 million practicing lawyers, but the lawyers are clearly much more represented. 11 of 14 of these physicians in Congress are Republicans, and 7 out of 11 voted not to ratify Joe Biden's election. So clearly, these are not the natural attorneys of the poor. So once again, I think if we have a problem, it's because we ourselves, as physicians, are part of the problem. So we should get involved. Nature published an article on that. The idea that competent scientists should be apolitical is false. It costs lives. The label activist should be an honor. Now, the European Union has a commissioner, basically the president, who's actually a GP from Germany. Is she a politician? Is she an activist? Is she an advocate? So let me give you a little bit of this terminology. An advocate is what we all do when we call an insurance company that is denying a test and we try to advocate for our patient. The New England Journal of Medicine wrote about that. More subtle is the separation between an activist and a politician. So let me tell you about that. And this was clarified in an editorial in the New York Times by Charles Blow. The politician may be popular, the activist rarely is. The politician can unify, the activist divides. The politician seeks to unify people around a set of beliefs. The activist seeks to right a wrong that has been held up by a set of beliefs. In short, the politician navigates the system. The activist defies it. The politician builds a coalition by using middling philosophy and policies that appeal to the most and offend the fewest. The activist is driven by purpose, morality, righteousness. There is a reason most of our greatest activists in America never became politicians, because they would have had to compromise too much of themselves and their causes. But it's also often true that the presence of an extremist wing is what makes successes of the moderate position possible. Our moment needs radical young activists, and I think that's very important. So I'm going to conclude by giving you briefly some information about Bernie Lown that I had the good luck of meeting 3 years ago and spending 3 days with him in Boston, because we interviewed him for our medical school. Lown had been the mentor of my dean, and my dean took me to Boston and I met him, the 3 most inspirational days of my life. So who was Bernie Lown? Bernie Lown I had met when I read this book, a very provocative book, where he talks about how today's physicians are more preoccupied with laying tools rather than hands. He talks about the art of medicine, the lost art of medicine, the lost soul of medicine. So clearly he's talking about healers. Then I realized that he was an interesting person. First of all, he came to this country when he was 14 years old from Lithuania. They were Jewish, and they were not particularly well off. He left behind a huge family, including a grandfather that he loved very much. When the Germans invaded the country, they rounded them all up and burned them into a synagogue. So Lown had as his motto, never whisper in the presence of wrong. Now, he went to college and studied the classics. That didn't get him into medicine, so eventually Hopkins was open-minded enough to take him. And then he went to Harvard, where he invented the defibrillator. Never made a penny. He refused to patent it. He wanted people to have access to it as quickly as possible, and he still lived in a very modest home in a suburb of Boston. Then he co-founds Physicians for Social Responsibility, and ultimately, with a Russian cardiologist, he co-founds International Physicians Against Nuclear War. Here they are getting their Nobel, and after they receive it, there is a press conference, and a Russian journalist drops dead. So they resuscitate him, and they shock him. And Laun immediately uses the opportunity to give us a piece of his mind. We have just witnessed what doctoring is all about. When faced with a dire emergency of sudden cardiac arrest, doctors don't inquire whether the patient was a good person or a criminal. We don't delay treatment to learn the politics or the character of the victim. We respond not as ideologues, not as Russians or Americans, but as doctors. The only thing that matters is saving a human life. We work with colleagues, whatever their political persuasion, whether capitalists or communists. This culture permeates our organization. The war is threatened, and we work with doctors, whatever their political convictions, to save our endangered home. So, not surprisingly, these are concepts that actually have been introduced by Osler himself. Osler writes, distinctions of race, nationality, color, creed are unknown within the portals of the temple of Aesculapius. We are indeed profoundly the citizen, the ultimate citizen of the world. So in an interview before he died, they asked him, where do you get all your energy? You're 97, 98. And he said, anger. And I understand him actually, because there is so much to be angry about. At home, I keep a button that says, if you're not pissed off, you're not paying attention. So for you, as the ones who will have to fix it, pay attention. We got a pandemic crisis, but more importantly, we have a lesson to learn. Will we learn that we live in a global society, or will we go back to the nation states? Merkel in May put it simply, the nation state alone doesn't have a future. Nothing new. Kennedy said it 50 years ago.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.
In the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit the small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. So can we all live together? This is the dome of the Capitol, the one that on January 6th was stormed by Trump supporters. And while those guys were taking pictures of themselves at the bottom of the dome, they should have looked up, because this fresco made by an Italian painter from Rome on the opposite side of George Washington has the motto of the US. How can we create one from many? How can we learn to live together as brothers instead of perishing together like fools? Unfortunately, here in the US, we didn't do too well. We lined up for guns. We resisted reopening. We resisted vaccines. We resisted masks, even though in 1918, we wore masks and sent to jail people that didn't wear them. But physicians did relatively well. Residents in New York went on strike to protect their patients. And they also demanded greater protection from themselves. In Peru, physicians went on hunger strike, demanding better protection. So all of this to tell you, get involved. The Surgeon General of the US under Obama, Vivek Murthy, put it simply, people will accuse us of being political. But if people accuse you of being political because you're standing up for people that can't stand up for themselves, then you have to do it, because that is at the heart of our profession, which is, of course, what Virchow believed. He believed that we have such an intimate knowledge of how societal problems impact on health that we are uniquely suited to make better statesmen and better stateswomen. And he converted that belief into action. Laun encouraged us to revolt. So all of this, and Laun put it very well, doctors of conscience have the moral obligation to resist the industrialization of their profession. So if we go into medicine to make a difference, which is what Lown said, then one cannot be committed to health without being engaged in social struggle for health. Bishop called us the natural attorneys of the poor. Lown called us advocates for the sick, the poor, the afflicted. Lown believed that we still have clout, and I think he's right. Still, this is the most trusted man in today's America. So what do we need to make a difference? If the problems that are coming are indeed global and are going to affect the entire planet, and Lown wrote about it in the last few years of his life, and clearly global warming is moving fast, we need to get involved. Global warming might have even been one of the reasons behind the onset of coronavirus, because the changing weather moved around the bat population. So if this is humanity's greatest existential crisis, get involved. Will you get involved? What will you need? I think clearly you need not to believe that Goldfarb is right when he says, stay in your lane. I told you about Dante, but I would like to end with even more poignant words by an Italian politician whose name was Antonio Gramsci, who was jailed by Mussolini for 20 years. And he said, I hate the bystanders. I can't stand their whining of innocence. I hold each of them accountable for the job that life asked of them and keep asking daily. I hold them responsible for what they have done, but more importantly, for what they have not done. In this, I'm merciless. I can't waste my compassion. I can't share my tears. I'm a man of commitment and thus loathe those who refuse to commit. I hate the bystanders. Now, the Greeks in democracy were convinced that everybody had to participate. So people that abstained from participation, they had a term for that. They called them idiotes. And I think that is still applicable today. So what's the recipe? You'll need eclecticism, you'll need a sense of social responsibilities, and you'll need critical thinking. Of course, you'll need tons of wisdom and foresight in order to use science appropriately. And also, of course, you need leadership skills. But that's what doctors are all about, aren't we? In the end, you need to remember that medicine comes with social responsibilities. The physicians are the ultimate citizens of the world, and that none of us is safe until all of us are safe. You need idealism. I was rereading the autobiography of Albert Schweitzer because I was reading it with a group of students, and there was a paragraph that touched me. He writes, judging by what I've learned about men and women, I am convinced that far more idealistic aspiration exists than is ever evident. Just as the rivers we see are much less numerous than the underground streams, so the idealism that is visible is minor compared to what men and women carry in their hearts, unreleased or scarcely released. Mankind is waiting and longing for those that can accomplish the task of releasing what is knotted and bringing the underground waters to the surface. And that's why leaders are so important. And that has been, I think, the sad discovery of the past year. There are no leaders around. There are essentially managers, but no leaders. So why do you have to do it? You have to do it because what we do for ourselves dies with us, but what we do for others and the world remains and is immortal. And also because if you want to leave a good planet and a healthy planet to your children and to my grandchildren, you got to do it. So that's why I think it's important for us to remember these two men. And it's nice to know that once upon a time, they used to live on this planet.